What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today's June 23rd, 2026, about 8:30 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 22nd book in our Book to React series. We are in Volume 2 of the History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2 by Leon Trotsky. Today is episode 35, and for today we will be reading chapter 34, The Rising Tide. Hopefully, because the last few chapters have just been very depressing, as Trotsky is recounting in vivid detail the repression and counter-revolution staged by the bourgeoisie. Hopefully he's going to show how the workers are fighting back. I mean, he has been showing that, but the previous chapter ended with a very bloody story of the Russian officers shelling and shooting at and killing their own soldiers who were revolting after being sold into semi-slavery in France. It was a crazy story. Go check out the previous episodes and everything that we have done so far. There's a lot to cover, but we are in, the tail end of this book. We're in like the bottom third, and I'm looking forward to finishing it because I've gained a lot from it, but this has been a momentous gargantuan task that I've been undertaking, trying to tackle this entire text. We have both live streams going. We have the horizontal live stream. I promise to pay attention to the horizontal live stream. And we also have the vertical live stream going as well. So I'm looking forward to reading the comments from people that are engaged with the text or answering the questions related to the text. Looking forward to that. Without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 34, The Rising Tide. The strong weapon of slander proved a two-edged one. If the Bolsheviks are German spies, why does the news come chiefly from sources most hateful to the people? Why is it the cadet press, which has always attributed to the workers and soldiers the lowest possible motives, that is, loudest and clearest of all in accusing the Bolsheviks? Why does that reactionary overseer or engineer who has been crouching in a corner since the insurrection now suddenly jump out and begin to curse the Bolsheviks? Why have the most reactionary officers begun to swagger in their regiments? And why, in accusing Lenin and co., do they shake their fist in the very faces of the soldiers, as though they were the traitors? Every factory had its Bolsheviks. Do I look like a German spy, boys, eh? A fitter would ask, or a cabinet maker whose whole life history was known to the workers. At times, even the compromisers, in their struggle against the assault of the counter-revolution, would go farther than they planned and unintentionally smooth the path for the Bolsheviks. The soldier, Perayko, tells how, at a soldiers' meeting, an army physician, Markovich, a follower of Plekhanov, refused the accusation of espionage against Lenin in order the more effectively to attack his political views as inconsistent and ruinous. In vain. If Lenin is intelligent and not a spy, not a traitor, and wants to make peace, then we are for him, said the soldiers after the meeting. After the temporary halt in its growth, Bolshevism again began confidently spreading its wings. The compensation is coming fast, wrote Trotsky in the middle of August. Driven, persecuted, slandered, our party has never grown so swiftly as in recent days. And this process will not be long in running from the capital into the provinces, from the cities into the villages and the army. All the toiling masses of the country will have learned, when new trials come, to unite their fate with the fate of our party. As before, Petrograd took the lead. It seemed as though an almighty broom was busy in the factories, sweeping the influence of the compromisers out of every last nook and cranny. The last fortresses of defensism are falling, said the Bolshevik paper. Was it so long ago that the defensist gentlemen were the sole bosses in the giant Obukhovsky factory? Now they don't dare show their faces in that factory. About 550,000 votes were cast in the elections for the Petrograd City Duma on August 20th. Considerably less than in the July elections for the district, over 200,000 votes. About 550,000 votes were cast in the elections for the Petrograd City Duma on August 20th, considerably less than in the July elections for the district Dumas. After losing upward of 375,000, the social revolutionaries still got over 200,000 votes, or 37% of the whole number. The Kadets got a fifth of the whole number. A pitiful 23,000 votes, writes Sukhanov, were cast out for Menshevik ballots. Unexpectedly to everybody, the Bolsheviks got almost 200,000 votes, or about 1/3 of the whole number. So what Trotsky is laying out here is that the Bolsheviks, despite the repression, despite the brutal counter-revolution that was waged by the bourgeoisie who still remain in power or are trying to cling to power, the Bolsheviks are still popular, and that's because they were consistent. I think we spoke about this in our previous live stream. If not the one yesterday, then the day before. What we have been learning from this book and also in our own lifetime is that people like people that are fixed, consistent, and reliable, and you know where they stand. And that's what we need to take, okay? Continuing here. At a regional conference of trade unions, which took place in the Urals in the middle of August, uniting 150,000 workers, resolutions of a Bolshevik character were carried upon all questions. In Kiev, at a conference of the factory and shop committees on the 20th of August, the Bolshevik resolution was carried by a majority of 161 votes against 35, with 13 abstaining. At the democratic elections for the city Duma of Ivanovo-Vosnesensk, which coincided exactly with the Kornilov revolt, the Bolsheviks got 58 seats out of 102, the Social Revolutionaries 24, the Mensheviks 4. In Kronstadt, a Bolshevik, Brekman, was elected president of the Soviet, and a Bolshevik, Pokrovsky, burgomaster. It was far from being so obvious everywhere, and in some places there was a decline. But during August, Bolshevism was growing almost throughout the whole breadth of the land. So, for anybody who's tuning in right now, where I'm from in Louisiana, people consistently vote for right-wing reactionaries who continue to denigrate their lives. And I do think that is because of the culture that we live in, and also the impact of white supremacy on the minds of people who just think the social benefits of maintaining white racial hegemony in the South is vitally important to their own survival. I do think that is vitally why a lot of people remain Republican in the deep South, like where I'm from. But I also think it's because they know exactly where the Republicans stand. They know exactly that the Republicans are going to be like, no to brown people, no to diversity, no to any sort of benefits for workers, such as unionization or, higher wages or anything like that, and no to any sort of progress for women. You know what I mean? Let that bitch die if she needs an abortion. You get what I'm saying? That's what we need. Also, you know what I'm saying, on the left. People need to know exactly where we stand, because this is why the Bolsheviks continued to have so much benefit and so much support from the people. Okay? So, shout out to Dude Crystal Alafumi up in the chat, and shout out to him for explaining to the people up in the live stream as well. For anybody joining the live stream. Shout out to Dude Crystal Alafumi. Because, Dude Crystal, you are tuned in and you're tuned up, I'm going to make you a moderator. So that way you can get some white supremacists out of here as well. Okay? All right, so Dude Crystal is now a new commissar in the Simon Soviet, because that was such an excellent explanation for the people right here. Thank you so much for that. And make sure, if you still have the time, Dude Crystal, to stay, that the white supremacists, the fascists, and the trolls all get excommunicated from our community. Thank you so much, okay? Continuing here. The revolt of Kornilov gave a powerful impetus to the radicalization of the masses. Trotsky has recalled upon the theme of a word of Marx: a revolution needs from time to time the whip of the counter-revolution. The danger has awakened not only energy but penetration. The collective thought was working at a higher tension. There was no lack of data from which to draw conclusions. A coalition had been declared necessary for the defense of the revolution, and meanwhile the ally in the coalition had turned up on the side of the counter-revolution. The Moscow Conference had been declared a review of the national unity. Only the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks had given warning. The conference will inevitably turn into the instrument of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Events had verified this, and now Kerensky was declaring the Moscow Conference. This was a prologue to the 27th of August. Here was carried out an estimate of forces. Here the future dictator, Kornilov, was first introduced to Russia. As though Kerensky had not been the initiator, organizer, and president of this conference, and as though it were not he who had introduced Kornilov as the first soldier of the revolution. As though it had not been the provisional government which armed Kornilov with the death penalty against the soldier, and as though the warnings of the Bolsheviks had not been denounced as demagogism. So, once again, for anybody tuning in just now, Kornilov is this guy who is a right-wing fascist. You know, he is in the army and he's gaining a followership of people that want to see him be the dictator of Russia. And this guy whose name's Kerensky, who is the leader of the provisional bourgeois government, who is also a socialist, but in name only, is actually trying to bolster this guy Kornilov to become the strong-arm dictator of the country. Even though they are using this to say they are defending the revolution, the February Revolution, and they still want to continue the war. They still want to continue the exploitation of the workers and the peasants, etc. And the irony of it all is that the Bolsheviks were warning people about this the entire time. Continuing here. The Petrograd garrison remembered, moreover, that 2 days before the uprising of Kornilov, the Bolsheviks had voiced the suspicion at a meeting of the soldiers' section that the progressive regiments were being removed from the capital with counter-revolutionary aims. To this, the representatives of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries had replied with a threatening demand. Do not venture upon a discussion of the military orders of General Kornilov. A resolution had been introduced and carried in that spirit. The Bolsheviks, it seems, were not talking through their hats. That is what the non-party workers and soldiers must be saying to himself right now. If the conspiring generals were guilty, according to the belated accusation of the compromisers themselves, not only of surrendering Riga, but also of the July breach, then why bait the Bolsheviks and execute the soldiers? If military provocateurs attempted to bring the workers and soldiers into the streets on the 27th of August, did they not play their role also in the bloody encounters of July 4th? Moreover, what is the position of Kerensky in all of this history? Against whom did he summon the 3rd Cavalry Corps? Why did he name Savinkov Governor General and Filonenko his assistant? And who is this Filonenko, this candidate for the Directory? An unexpected answer came from the Armored Car Division. Filonenko, who had served with them as a lieutenant, had inflicted the worst kinds of taunts and humiliations upon the soldiers. Where did this shady performer Zavoyko come from? What, in general, does this selection of swindlers for the highest positions signify? The facts were simple, remembered by many, accessible to all, irrefutable and deadly. The echelons of the savage division, the torn-up rails, the mutual accusations between the Winter Palace and headquarters, the testimonies of Savinkov and Kerensky, all spoke for themselves. What an irrefutable indictment of the compromisers and their regime. The meaning of the baiting of Bolsheviks had become utterly clear. It had been an indispensable element in the preparation for a coup d'etat. The workers and soldiers, as they began to see all this, were seized with the sharp feeling of shame. Lenin is in hiding, then merely because they have vilely slandered him. The others are in jail, then to please the cadets, the generals, the bankers, and diplomats of the Entente. The Bolsheviks, then, are not office seekers, and they are hated up above exactly because they do not want to join the stock company, which they call a coalition. This was the understanding arrived at by the hard workers, by the simple people, by the oppressed. And out of these moods, together with a feeling of guilt before the Bolsheviks, grew an unconquerable loyalty to the party and confidence in its leaders. So, what Trotsky just said here is very, very beautiful. That's one of my favorite paragraphs in the entire book. Because that almost brought a tear to my eye, low-key. Because what he is saying here is that they lied on the Bolsheviks. They called Lenin a black gay trans woman with a big black cock. They said he was a German spy. They said the Bolsheviks were agent provocateurs sent from above or sent from outside Russia to bring destabilization and anarchy to Russia. And they sent them to jail. Some of them were killed. And the bourgeoisie and the powers that be are doing everything they can to oppress them. And because they are so hated, the people love them even more. Is there not greater wisdom than that? You know, I often evoke religion when I talk about this, but think about how the Christians were sent to the Colosseums to be eaten in front of the Romans by lions, and the Christians were defiled. The Christians were hated. Think about the early Ummah. If you're a Muslim like me, the early Ummah was hated by the Quraysh, who were the ruling tribe of Mecca and by and large the Arabian region. They were hated, and yet and still, because they were so hated, the people loved them even more. Because why would these people who are defenseless, weak, meek, saying that they want peace, why are they being so oppressed and repressed? They must be standing on some type of truth. This is a deep wisdom that I think we should all reflect upon. And I think it goes to show that victory will be ours as long as we remain clear and focused and honest and truthful in our assessment of our situation now. Why we need radical change, why we need revolution, why we need to topple the forces of capitalism and white supremacy and all the other aspects that bring down the human spirit and bring down human freedom. This is what I think is vitally important. And I love that paragraph so much. That's one of my favorite paragraphs out of many that I've read in this book. Continuing here. The old soldiers, the standing elements of the army, the artillerymen, the staff of non-commissioned officers resisted up to the very last days with all their powers. They did not want to set a cross against all their fighting labors, their sacrifices, their deeds of heroism. Can it be that all that was squandered for nothing? But when the last prop was knocked out from under them, they turned sharply, left about face, to the Bolsheviks. Now they had utterly come over to the revolution, their non-commissioned officers' chevrons, their soldiers' wills tempered in battle, their bulging jaw muscles, and all. They had got fooled on the war, but this time they would carry the thing through to the end. In the reports of local authorities, both military and civil, Bolshevism had become in these days a synonym for every kind of mass activity, every decisive demand, every resistance against exploitation, every forward motion. In a word, it had become another name for revolution. Does that mean that all these things are Bolshevism? The strikers would ask themselves, and the protesting sailors, and the dissatisfied soldiers' wives, and the muzhiks in revolt. The masses were, so to speak, compelled from above to identify their intimate thoughts and demands with the slogans of Bolshevism. Thus, the revolution turned to its own uses, a weapon directed against it. In history, not only does the reasonable become nonsensical, but also, when the course of evolution requires it, the nonsensical becomes reasonable. The change in the political atmosphere revealed itself very clearly in the joint session of the executive committees of August 30th, when delegates from Kronstadt demanded that they receive seats in that high body. Could it be possible, where these unbridled Kronstadters had been subjected only to condemnations and excommunications, their representatives were now to take seats? But how refuse them? Only yesterday, the Kronstadt sailors and soldiers had come to the defense of Petrograd. Sailors from the Aurora were even now guarding the Winter Palace. After whispering among themselves, the leaders offered the Kronstadters 4 seats with a voice, but not a vote. The concession was accepted dryly, without expressions of gratitude. After the attempt of Kornilov, relates Chernovov, a soldier of the Moscow garrison, all the troops acquired a Bolshevik color. All were struck by the way in which the statement of the Bolsheviks came true, that General Kornilov would soon be at the gates of Petrograd. Mitrovich, a soldier of the Armored Car Division, recalls the heroic legends which passed from mouth to mouth Pause, no diddy. After the victory over the rebellious generals. They were nothing but stories of bravery and of great deeds, and of how well, if there is such bravery, we can fight the whole world. Here the Bolsheviks came into their own. Antonov Ovchinko, liberated from prison on the day of the Kornilov campaign, went immediately to Helsingfors. An immense change had occurred in the masses, he says. At the regional congress of the Finland Soviets, the right social revolutionaries were in a tiny minority. The Bolsheviks, in coalition with the left social revolutionaries, had taken the lead. As president of the regional committee of the Soviet, they elected Smilga, who in spite of his extreme youth was a member of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks, a man with a strong urge leftward, and who had already in the April days revealed an inclination to shake down the provisional government. As president of the Helsingfors Soviet, which rested upon the garrison and the Russian workers, they elected Scheinman, a Bolshevik, the future director of the Soviet State Bank, a man of cautious and bureaucratic mold, but who, at that time, was marching abreast with the other leaders. The provisional government had forbidden the Finlanders to convoke the Sejm, dissolved by it. The regional committee suggested that the Sejm assemble and volunteered to defend it. The committee refused to fulfill the orders of the provisional government, withdrawing various military units from Finland. Especially the Bolsheviks had here already established a dictatorship of the Soviets in Finland. At the beginning of September, a Bolshevik paper wrote, "From a whole series of Russian cities, the news comes that the organizations of our party have grown immensely in the recent period. But still more significant is the growth of our influence in the broadest democratic masses of the workers and soldiers, even in those plants where at first they had refused to listen to us," writes the Bolshevik Averin from Ekaterinoslav. "The workers were on our side in the Kornilov days. When the rumor came that Kaledin was mobilizing the Cossacks against Saracen and Saratov," writes Antonov, one of the leaders of the Saratov Bolsheviks. "When this rumor was confirmed and reinforced by the insurrection of General Kornilov, the masses got over their former prejudices in a few days." The Bolshevik paper in Kiev stated on the 19th of September, "In the election for the Soviets, 12 comrades were elected from the arsenal. All Bolsheviks, all the Menshevik candidates were defeated. The same thing is happening in a whole series of other plants. Similar dispatches are to be found from now on every day in the pages of the workers' press. The hostile press tried in vain to minimize or hush up the growth of Bolshevism. The masses, leaping forward, seem to be trying to make up for the time lost in their former waverings, hesitations, and temporary retreats. There was a universal, obstinate, and unrestrainable flood tide." A member of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks, Varvara Yakovleva, from whom we learned in July and August about the extreme weakening of the Bolsheviks in the whole Moscow region, now testifies to an abrupt change. During the second half of September, she reports to the conference, "The workers of the regional bureau made the rounds of the region. Their impressions were absolutely identical. Everywhere, in all the provinces, the process was underway of general Bolshevization of the masses, and everyone observed likewise that the villages were demanding Bolsheviks. In those localities where after the July days the organizations of the party had disintegrated, they were now reborn and were growing rapidly. In the districts into which Bolsheviks had not been admitted, party nuclei were now spontaneously arising. Even in the backward provinces of Tambovsk and Ryazan, in those bulwarks of the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, which formerly in making their rounds the Bolsheviks had passed by through sheer hopelessness, a veritable revolution was now occurring. The influence of the Bolsheviks was growing by leaps and bounds, and the compromisist organizations were dissolving." So once again, this is very inspiring. And the reason I started even reading this book is not because I have a profound love of Trotsky. I didn't start reading this book because I have an admiration or worship for the Soviet Union. I started reading this book for inspiration and insight on how we can overturn the wicked, capitalistic, imperialistic, racist, white supremacist, sexist, homophobic system in America to make a better world. And what we are seeing here from Trotsky's retelling of how the Bolsheviks came to power is that the Bolsheviks were, one, very organized, very principled, very disciplined, followed the people, let the people make the decisions, and also at the same time they stood their ground. They stood their ground and they were very clear on what they believed in, what their vision was, and the people finally saw the light after years of repression. Okay, so very, very important for us to take all of this in. Even in places where Bolsheviks were banned in Russia, people started saying that I'm a Bolshevik. You get what I'm saying? It's like that situation where everybody says, I am Spartacus. The Romans show up and they try to arrest Spartacus after defeating the army or something like that. And all the soldiers say, I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. You get what I'm saying? That's what happens here. I'm a Bolshevik. No, I'm a Bolshevik. You get what I'm saying? So continuing here. The reports of the delegates to the Bolshevik conference of the Moscow region a month after the Kornilov uprising and a month before the insurrection of the Bolsheviks are filled with confidence and enthusiasm. In Nizhny Novgorod, after a 2 months decline, the party is again living a full life. Social revolutionary workers are coming over to the Bolsheviks by the hundreds. In Tver, a broad party work has developed only since the Kornilov days. The compromisers are going to pieces. Nobody listens to them. They are being chased out. In Vladimir province, the Bolsheviks have grown so strong that at a provincial congress of the Soviets, only 5 Mensheviks are to be found and only 3 social revolutionaries. In Ivanovo-Voznесенsk, the Russian Manchester, that's hilarious. The whole work in the Soviets, the Duma, and the Zemstvo has been turned over to the Bolsheviks as the semi-sovereign masters. Now, this is a question for the audience because what Trotsky is really talking about here is setting up a parallel state, saying that the state that was before has no legitimacy and we are creating our own, if you want to phrase it this way, autonomous zones. Our autonomous zones are interconnected because we are only taking legitimacy from other Soviets like us within this state. Even though this provisional government says that they run shit, we are creating our own state. Do you think this is a viable strategy to overturn the decadent American society? Do you think that this is a good strategy? That we set up an autonomous zone in Memphis, in New Orleans, in Houston, in Dallas, and then these autonomous zones interact with each other interconnectedly? Or does that have to be paired with larger mass movements across the country? Or could we start the process already of creating autonomous zones where we, the people, are dictating what happens in our societies and creating a more fair and equitable society? Anyway, I will continue here. The organizations of the party are growing, but its forces of attraction is growing incomparably faster. The lack of correspondence between the technical resources of the Bolsheviks and their relative political weight finds its expression in the small number of members of the party compared to the colossal growth of its influence. Events are sweeping the masses so powerfully and swiftly into their whirlpool that the workers and soldiers have no time to organize themselves in a party. They have no time even to understand the necessity of any special party organization. They drink up the Bolshevik slogans just as naturally as they breathe the air. That the party is a complicated laboratory in which these slogans have been worked out on the basis of collective experience is still not clear to their minds. There are over 20 million people represented in the Soviets. The party, which had on the very eve of the October Revolution only 240,000 members, was more and more confidently leading these millions through the medium of the trade unions, the factory and shop committees, and the Soviets. Throughout this vast country, shaken to its depths, and with an inexhaustible variety of local conditions and political levels of development, some sort of elections were going on every day. To the Dumas, the Zemstvos, the Soviets, the factory and shop committees, the trade unions, the army or land committees. And throughout all these elections, there appears like a red thread one unchanging fact: the growth of the Bolsheviks. The elections to the district Dumas of Moscow astonished the country, especially with the sharp change they indicated in the mood of the masses. The great party of the social revolutionaries retained at the end of September only 54,000 of the 375,000 votes it had counted in June. The Mensheviks had fallen from 76,000 to 16,000. The Kadets kept 101,000, having lost only 8,000. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, had risen from 75,000 to 198,000 votes. Whereas in June, the social revolutionaries had 58% of the votes. In September, the Bolsheviks had approximately 52%. The garrison voted 90% for the Bolsheviks. In some detachments, over 95%. In the shops of the heavy artillery, the Bolsheviks got 2,286 out of 2,347 votes. A considerable lowering of the number of voters was due to the fact that many small-town people, who in the vapor of their first illusions had joined the compromisers, fell back soon after into political non-existence. The Mensheviks were melting away completely. The social revolutionaries received half as many votes as the Kadets. The Kadets received half as many as the Bolsheviks. Those September votes for the Bolsheviks were won in a bitter struggle with all the other parties. They were strong votes. They were to be relied on. The wiping out of intermediate groups, the significant stability of the bourgeois camp, the gigantic growth of the most hated and persecuted proletarian party. These were unmistakable symptoms of a revolutionary crisis. Yes, the Bolsheviks worked zealously and unceasingly, writes Sukhanov, who himself belonged to the shattered party of the Mensheviks. They were among the masses, in the factories, every day and all the time. They became the party of the masses because they were always there, guiding both in great things and the small, the whole life of the factories and barracks. The masses lived and breathed together with the Bolsheviks. They were wholly in the hands of the party of Lenin and Trotsky. This is something else that we have to keep in mind. And this is a political point too. Think about how most of the people who are in MAGA disagree with the MAGA policies. If you actually sit down and tell most MAGA three-tooth rednecks, like where I come from in Louisiana, what MAGA is about, more money for Israel, socialism for farmers and for major corporations, give them a bunch of money and tax cuts, but fuck you, poor working man. Actually tell them about how more women are going to die from preventable, harmful pregnancies that should be terminated in any other timeline where doctors are able to do their fucking job. Ask them actually about the policies of MAGA, like, for example, kids getting, measles and mumps and fucking diseases like bubonic plague coming back to life because we want to defund actually trying to stop these preventable diseases because it's woke and DEI infused. Actually talk to them, and a lot of them say, oh, I don't actually like that. It's probably, or very much likely, very much the same for these people who are voting for the Bolsheviks. I'm sure a lot of them had no idea about, surplus value, exploitation from capital. They had no idea that the Bolsheviks thought about a dictatorship of the proletariat and all the other crazy things us Marxists believe, rightly so, because they are correct. They didn't know about none of that. They just saw that the Bolsheviks were consistently with the people, standing up for the people, side by side with the people. And this is something that we should take in mind. Most likely, we will always have homophobic people. We will have racist people. We will have, people with fascistic tendencies and outlooks. That doesn't mean that they won't vote for us. If we consistently prove to them that our ideas are right, our policies are right, to make them have a better quality of life, they will vote for us, even if they think, I think a boy is a boy and a girl is a girl, and how you're born is how you die. Okay? So, yeah. Anyway, going to the comments here from Duke Crystal, La Fumerie. Local autonomous zones without a larger unity or strategy are only waiting to be savagely repressed. The forces of capital and reaction are not passive. Absolutely true. I agree with that wholeheartedly, Duke Crystal. Absolutely a good point. I do think that there has to be a multi-pronged attack on the system before we can even think of creating the autonomous zone of Nashville or Atlanta. You get what I'm saying? But I do think that's something that we should, take into account when strategizing the ultimate goals of our revolution, right? We want to create, the workers' state of America. And so I think a lot of us right now on the left are focused on, propaganda, radicalization, and also getting people involved in politics just on the basic level, such as liberal electoralism, right? Going out and, volunteering for the DSA to canvass, or voting for your local DSA candidate for state senate or whatever, something like that, right? Like, we're just trying to get people at the basic level of radicalization, which is right. But I do think we need to have a larger goal vision of what the revolution will look like. You know what I mean? Because right now the left is, fighting blindly. We're fighting real blindly. And I do think it's important for us to have a goal in mind. And there's nothing wrong with having that goal in mind of, establishing, autonomous zones, setting up, workers' councils. We need to demonstrate to the people, to have the government in waiting. You get what I'm saying? I don't remember the name, but I believe there is a right-wing Christian fundamentalist organization out there that is doing the same thing. Of course, right-wing Christian nationalists are all over the federal government and local government, such as in my home state of Louisiana. But there is a Christian right-wing group that has a shadow parallel government in waiting that is seeking to take power. This isn't like some fictional shit. It's like a real, we have a bunch of crazy political and religious cults in America. And this is one of them that I heard about. I don't know the name, but if I find it, I will post it up on my channel section. But if you've heard about it, let me know. But I've heard about Christian groups saying that they want to establish something like a Gilead, and they have it in waiting and ready. Okay? All right. Kareth says, PWT can realize solidarity. I'm not sure about that. PWT, what the hell is PWT? Y'all just write it out, man. Come on, man. Don't waste my time with comments like this. I'm not sure that PWT. What is that? Okay. All right. Puerto Ricans with titties. I'm not sure that Puerto Ricans with titties can realize solidarity. Okay. I'm not sure Panamanians walking while they twerk can realize solidarity. What the fuck is PWT? Okay. Duke Crystal says it's Insurgency 101. It's been the last few decades in the Middle East, I guess. You know what I mean? I don't think we're at the point of, insurgency. You know what I'm saying? But I do think, because reading this book, we've dealt with a lot of radical ideas, and we've realized that there are many strategies that we could use to destabilize this government. You get what I'm saying? And I'm not going to go into detail onto everything that we've covered here, because go check out the previous live streams of some of the wild stuff I've said that's flown under the radar, thankfully. But I do think that, we should be thinking about, our strategy for establishing I do think we should be thinking about establishing a parallel state. Okay? Duke Crystal says, meaning that the Taliban built a parallel government and legal system. That's what I think we should be trying to do. That's what I think. I think we should be looking at establishing not only a vanguard party, but a vanguard type of, parallel government. You know what I'm saying? And I do think we can actually put it in practice. We should be learning from the Black Panther Party, because the survival programs and everything that they tried to do was trying to establish a separate society, I guess, in a type of way. You could go to the Black Panthers for legal defense. You could go to the Black Panthers for food. You could go to the Black Panthers for medical care. You could go to the Black Panthers for clothing. You could go to the Black Panthers for self-defense. You know what I mean? Like, that's a type of parallel government, or things we could do to create that parallel society to show people we have a better way, rather than, this bourgeois dictatorship we live under. Okay? Kareth in the horizontal live stream says, I'm thinking of how they overturned Black Republican government in Wilmington, North Carolina, which brought material benefits. And then he says, come on, man, like Terrence Howard. I don't know what you're talking about. What is a PWT? What is a PWT? Okay? pretty white ting, a pretty white ting. I'm not sure that pretty white tings can realize solidarity. I don't know, man. I've had a lot of solidarity with many pretty white tings. So yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. But if you're talking about the autonomous zones, You know what I'm saying? Like, this is the thing. Those instances where basically a white mob overturned a black elected government, like in Wilmington, North Carolina, that's a facet of white supremacy that I think we can challenge. We do have whites we can be in solidarity with. I do think there are white people that we can be in solidarity with. I wouldn't be a communist if I just thought that all white people were racist and evil. No, not all white people are racist and evil. That's really fucking stupid. Well, some of the people that imbibe in white supremacist thinking really are, and those are people that we need to propagandize to hopefully convert and change. But that is not going to stop us from continuing to do the work of propaganda. Okay? All right. Continuing here. So, so on the front, all right, on the front, the political picture was more variegated. There were regiments and divisions which had never yet heard or seen a Bolshevik. Many of them were sincerely astounded when they were themselves accused of Bolshevism. On the other hand, divisions were to be found which took their own anarchistic moods, mingled with the dash of Black Hundredism, for pure Bolshevism. The mood of the front was leveling out in one direction, but in that colossal political flood which took the trenches for its channels, there occurred many whirlpools and backwashes, and there was no little turbidity. In September, the Bolsheviks broke through the cordon and got access to the front, from which they had been cut off in dead earnest for the last 2 months. Even now, the official veto was not removed. The compromisist committees did everything to keep the Bolsheviks out of their units, but all efforts were vain. The soldiers had heard so much about their own Bolshevism that they were all, without exception, dying to see and hear a live Bolshevik. The formal obstacles, delays, and complications thought up by the committeemen were wiped away by the insistence of the soldiers as soon as the news came that a Bolshevik had arrived. The old revolutionist Evgeny Bosch, who did a great work in the Ukraine, has left brilliant memoirs of her bold excursions into the primitive soldier jungle. The frightened warnings of her friends, both sincere and insincere, were everywhere refuted. In those divisions which had been described as bitterly hostile to the Bolsheviks, the orator, approaching her theme very cautiously, would soon find out that the listeners were with her. There was no coughing or hawking or nose blowing. Those first indications of boredom in a soldier audience, the silence and order were complete. The meetings would end in stormy ovations in honor of that bold agitator. In general, the whole journey of Evgeny Bosch along the front was a kind of triumphal procession. Less heroic, less effective, but essentially the same, was the experience of agitators of less distinguished caliber. So, salute to Comrade Evgeny Bosch. Think about this. Trotsky is pointing out here that this young girl, this young woman, well, they don't actually give her name. In fact, they say she's an old revolutionist. Anyway, this revolutionary woman, Evgeny Bosch, goes to the front line of Russia's place in World War I to speak to the soldiers about explicit communism, explicit Bolshevism, when a lot of these soldiers have only heard negative things about the Bolsheviks or nothing at all. And despite probably her girlfriends telling her, girl, you fucking crazy. You trying to go out there with all those men who ain't seen a woman in months and you might get killed going to the front line. She does it anyway, speaks to the soldiers about explicit communism and what the communists believe. And what do the soldiers do? They stand up and applause. The soldiers actually, whistle. The soldiers actually salute her for her bravery and also because they agree with her ideas. In the previous live stream yesterday, I said that it was important that we have people who are able to communicate with people of different cultures, backgrounds, genders, races, etc., to explain their ideas. But also what people respect are people who are brave enough to actually talk to people who they think they hate them. You get what I'm saying? If I walk into a redneck bar in the middle of Mississippi where they're waving, the stars and bars, and I get on the fucking bar and I start talking about Bolshevism and communism and the need to overturn this capitalistic society because it keeps Mississippi poor. You get what I'm saying? they'll probably respect me. And I know how to move in the South. I know a lot of y'all have like caricatures of the South and what it's like. I know how to fucking move in the South. So I actually think I could do it. And I actually think that I'd be willing to take that risk. I'd run that risk on my life. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing. I also think something else that is to our advantage as open communists today is that communism is a dirty, dirty secret word. You get what I'm saying? I read Angela Davis's book, her autobiography last year. And in the book, she talks about how in her time, communism was seen as this dirty word, as if you were a devil worshiper or something like that. And a lot of that still exists in America today. You even have guys like Hassan Piker not willing to say that he's a communist when we know he is. Come on now. But then again, everyone has the right to identify how they identify. But because communism is a dirty word and most people have never met a communist, spoken to a communist, or even know anything about communism, that does allow us to enter in. Firstly, to make a good impression, but secondly, actually, to get them more interested. Because people have a tendency to like shit that seems a little bit subversive. People have a tendency to like shit that seems a little bit dangerous. That's how gangster rap became so fucking popular. A bunch of young black men from the ghettos and killing fields of America's streets standing up on stage and rapping about the harsh realities of ghetto life. You know, I grew up on the crime side, the New York Times side. Staying alive was no job, had second hands. Moms bounced on old men. So then we moved to Shaolin Land, a young youth rocking the gold tooth. Come on now. Like, these are almost like the national poetry of America, hip hop. And why is that? Because it's a little bit dangerous. It's a little bit extreme. It's a little bit out there. And because we are explicit communists, we have the same advantage. A lot of people want to hear our message. A lot of people want to hear our message because it is so radical and it is so different. And so we could use that to actually get people to pay attention. So yeah, I just wanted to end that rant right here. All right. So, Long Defiance says, Christianity is communist, but the churches have taken away your heritage. I don't know who your is. Please be definite in your comments. Please don't use pronouns like your, his, her. Please be definite so we know what you're talking about. I do believe there is a communist element in the teachings of Jesus, so I agree with that first part. But please explain what you mean by the second part, your heritage. Explain that part. Anyway, I will continue here. New ideas or ideas convincing in a new way, new slogans, new generalizations were bursting into the stagnant life of the trenches. The millions of soldiers' brains were grinding over the events, casting the balance of their political experience. Dear comrade workers and soldiers, writes a soldier at the front to the editor of the party paper, do not give free rein to that bad letter K, which had sold the whole world into bloody slaughter. That includes the first murderer, Kolka, Nicholas II, Kerensky, Kornilov, Kaledin, the Kadets, all of them on one letter K. The Cossacks are also dangerous for us. Fyodor Nikolaev. That's funny. Do not look for superstition here. This is merely a method of political mnemonics. The insurrection, starting at headquarters, could not but shock every fiber of the soldiers' being. That external discipline, the effort to restore, which had cost so many victims, was again going to pieces on all sides. The military commissar of the Western Front, Zhdanov, reported, the general mood is nervous, suspicious of officers, waiting. Refusal to obey orders is explained on the ground that they are Kornilov orders and should not be obeyed. Stankovich, who replaced Filonenko in the position of head commissar, writes to the same effect. The soldier masses felt themselves surrounded on all sides by treason. Anyone who tried to dissuade them from this seemed also a traitor. For the ranking officers, the collapse of Kornilov's adventure meant the collapse of their last hope. Even before that, the self-confidence of the commanding staff had been none too brilliant. We observed during the last days of August the military conspirators in Petrograd, drunk, boastful, and weak-willed. The officers now felt utterly despised and rejected. That hatred, that baiting, writes one of them, that complete inactivity and external expecting of arrest and shameful death drove the officers into the roadhouses, the private dining rooms, the hotels. In this drunken vapor, the officers were drowned. In contrast to this, the soldiers and sailors were more sober than ever before. They were caught up by a new hope. Damn. So the officers are seeing the writing on the wall. Shit's about to get really twisted. So now they just, drinking vodka. Were they drinking vodka at this time? This is a Russian book. This is the first, no, it's not the first book I've ever read by a Russian. I read some Dostoevsky many years ago. But vodka has not been mentioned once in all of Trotsky's text. Was vodka not popular then? Did the Soviet Union popularize vodka? If anybody knows, put it in the comment section. Because Trotsky's talking here like the officers are getting drunk and now they're just smoking their life away because all their underlings are becoming explicit communists now. And now they're drinking what? Whiskey? What were they drinking in Russia at this time, man? Not one word of vodka once. Not one word of vodka. Anyway, I continue here. The Bolsheviks, according to Stankovich, lifted up their heads and felt themselves to be complete masters in the army. The lower committees began to turn into Bolshevik nuclei. Every election in the army showed an amazing Bolshevik growth. And moreover, it is impossible to ignore the fact that the best and most tightly disciplined army, not only on the northern front, but perhaps on the whole Russian front, the Fifth Army was the first to elect a Bolshevik army committee. The fleet was still more clearly, concisely, and colorfully going Bolshevik. On September 8th, the Baltic sailors raised the battle flags on all ships as an expression of their readiness to fight for the transfer of power to the proletariat and peasantry. The fleet demanded an immediate armistice on all fronts, the transfer of land to the peasant committees, and the establishment of workers' control of production. 3 days later, the Central Committee of the Black Sea Fleet, less advanced and more moderate, supported the Baltic sailors, adopting the slogan of all power to the Soviets. The same slogan was adopted in the middle of September by 23 Siberian and Lettish infantry regiments of the 12th Army. Other divisions followed steadily. The demand for all power to the Soviets never again disappeared from the order of the day in the army or the fleet. Once again, this is another point I've constantly made, and if you've been listening for a while, you're very, very frustrated. I'm going to say this again. This shows the importance of propaganda to the Army, to the Navy, to the sailors, to cash money records. This is why it's very important for us to continue to propagandize to them, because the gun will come to us. If we are really about to overturn the capitalistic empire, which is America, and also Western civilization as it stands right now, you know what I'm saying? Western civilization in quotes, because there is no real such thing. It's amorphous and just ever evolving and, fit to some people's desires. But if we are to overturn this, yes, there will have to come a time when, weapons will have to be drawn. But we can't overturn this capitalistic empire with, the weapons that we get from down the street in our local gun shop. You get what I'm saying? But if we do proper propaganda, I'm telling you, what Trotsky is saying here is that the guns will come to us. It will fall into our hands. We could literally have a nuclear-powered submarine painted red if we do enough propaganda. That might seem crazy, but the Bolsheviks had an entire naval fleet. They had an entire naval fleet before the October Revolution. They had soldiers on the boats overturning their commanders, throwing them overboard, putting up a red flag, and saying this belongs to the Bolsheviks now. Think about that. Think about that. We could absolutely do the same thing. Continuing here. The sailors' meetings, says Stankovich, 9/10 of them consisted of Bolsheviks only. The new head commissar happened to be defending the provisional government before the sailors at Reval. He felt the futility of the attempt from the very first words. At the mere word government, the audience drew together with hostility. A wave of indignation, hatred, and distrust instantly seized the whole crowd. It was clear, strong, passionate, irresistible, and poured out in one unanimous shout, "Down with it!" We cannot withhold a word of praise to this storyteller, who does not forget to see beauty in the attack of a crowd mortally hostile to him. The question of peace, driven underground for these 2 months, now emerges with tenfold strength. At a meeting of the Petersburg Soviet, the officer Dubasov, arriving from the front, declares, "Whatever you may say here, the soldiers will not fight anymore." Voices reply, "Even the Bolsheviks don't say that." But the officer, not a Bolshevik, comes back. "I tell you what I know. and what the soldiers directed me to tell you. Another man from the front, a gloomy soldier in a long coat, soaked with the filth and stink of the trenches, declared to the Petrograd Soviet in those same September days that the soldiers needed peace, any kind of peace, even some sort of an indecent peace. Those harsher soldier words gave the Soviet a fright. That is how far things had gone then. The soldiers at the front were not little children. They excellently understood that with the present war map, the peace could only be an oppressor's peace. And for this understanding of his, the trench delegate purposely chose the crudest words possible, expressing the whole force of his disgust for a Hohenzollern peace. But with this very nakedness of his mind, the soldier compelled his hearers to understand that there was no other road, that the war had unwound the spirit of the army, that an immediate peace was necessary no matter what it cost. The bourgeois press seized the words of the trench orator with malicious joy, attributing them to the Bolsheviks. That phrase about an indecent peace was henceforward continually to the fore as an extreme expression of the savagery and depravity of the people. So because the people want peace, the bourgeois think that they have gone mad. Continuing. As a general rule, the compromisers were not at all inclined, like the political dilettante Stankovic, to admire the beauties of that rising tide which threatened to wash them off the revolutionary arena. They learned from day to day with amazement and horror that they no longer possessed any power of resistance. As a matter of fact, under the confidence of the masses in the compromisers, there had lain concealed from the first hours of the revolution a misunderstanding, historically inevitable but not long-lasting. Only a few months had been required to clear it up. The compromisers had been compelled to talk with the workers and soldiers in a wholly different language from that which they employed in the executive committee, and still more in the Winter Palace. The responsible leaders of the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks were more and more afraid as weeks passed to come out into the open square. Agitators of the second and third rank would go out, and they would accommodate themselves to the social radicalism of the people with the help of equivocal phrases, or else they will become sincerely infected with the mood of the factories, mines, and barracks, will begin to speak their language, and soon break away from their own parties. The sailor Kovrin tells his memoirs how these seamen who considered themselves social revolutionaries would in reality defend the Bolshevik platform. This was to be observed everywhere. The people knew what they wanted, but they did not know how to call it by name. That misunderstanding, which belonged to the inner essence of the February Revolution, had a universal, popular, mass character, especially in the villages, where it lasted longer than in the cities. Only experience could introduce order into this chaos. Events, little and great, were tirelessly shaking up the mass parties, bringing their membership into correspondence with their policy and not their signboards. An excellent example of this quid pro quo between the compromisers and the masses is to be seen in an oath taken at the beginning of July by 2,000 Donetsk miners, kneeling with uncovered heads in the presence of a crowd of 5,000 people, and with its participation, we swear by our children, by God, by the heaven and earth, and by all the things that we hold sacred in the world, that we will never relinquish the freedom brought with blood on the 28th of February, 1917. Believing in the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, we swear we will never listen to the Leninists, for they, the Bolshevik Leninists, are leading Russia to ruin with their agitation. Whereas the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, united in a single union, say, the land to the people, land without indemnities, the capitalist structure must fall after the war, and in place of capitalism there must be a socialist structure. We give our oath to march forward under the lead of these parties, not stopping even at death. This oath of the miners directed against the Bolsheviks in reality led straight to the Bolshevik Revolution. The February shell and the October kernel appear in this naive and fervent picture so clearly as in a way to exhaust the whole problem of the permanent revolution. Here's Trotsky trying to slide in here his permanent revolution theory. Here we go. We reject permanent revolution on this channel, but how do you feel? If you're listening right now, how do you feel about Trotsky's views on permanent revolution, which is his view that essentially We have to continue to agitate for socialist revolutions, particularly in the most advanced capitalist countries, because if there is no revolution or transition to socialism in the advanced West primarily, then all other socialist nations will fall. And to some degree, there's an argument for that because America is threatening Cuba right now. America is destabilizing the world as it is. But yeah, I don't think that's believable. And I do kind of also believe that with what the events that played out in the Cold War, that is actually not true. Half of Europe became socialist. And there were extreme socialist movements in Europe all throughout the 20th century. That still didn't lead to many of these socialist nations surviving as they currently exist. The socialist nations that do still exist, or the ones that claim to be, and the ones on the left generally are recognized as socialist, such as Vietnam, China, Cuba, etc., Laos, these countries, have survived because of the intercooperation between them, and also making peace with the capitalist nations around them as well. So I digress. So going here. Du Cristal Lafume says cultural revolution is the greatest of all. Explain that. What do you mean by cultural revolution? Okay? Explain that to me so I know what you are saying. Anyway, by September, the Donetsk miners, without betraying either themselves or their oath, had already turned their backs on the compromisers. The most backward ranks of the Ural miners had done the same thing. A member of the executive committee, the social revolutionary Ozhegov, a representative of the Urals, paid a visit early in August to his Izhevsky factory. I was dreadfully shocked, he writes in his sorrowful report, by the sharp changes which had taken place in my absence. The organization of the Social Revolutionary Party, which, both for its number, 8,000 members, and its activities, was known throughout the whole Ural region, had been disintegrated and reduced to 500 people, thanks to the irresponsible agitators. The report of Ozhegov did not bring any unexpected news to the executive committee. The same picture was to be seen in Petrograd. If after the July raids the social revolutionaries temporarily leapt to the front in the factories and even in some places increased their influence, their subsequent decline was only the more headlong. To be sure, Kerensky's government, conquered at the time, wrote the social revolutionary V. Zemzevov later. The Bolshevik demonstrators were scattered and the chiefs of the Bolsheviks arrested. But that was a Pyrrhic victory. That is quite true. Like King Pyrrhus, the compromisers won a victory at the price of their army. Whereas earlier, before July 3rd through the 5th, writes the Petrograd worker Skorenko, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries have been able in some places to appear before the workers without the risk of being whistled down. At present, they had no such guarantee. In general, they had no guarantees left. The Social Revolutionary Party had not only lost its influence, but had also changed its social constituency. The revolutionary workers had already either gone over to the Bolsheviks or, in taking flight, were going through an inner crisis. Let's read that again. The Social Revolutionary Party had not only lost its influence, but had also changed its social constituency. The revolutionary workers had already either gone over to the Bolsheviks or, in taking flight, were going through an inner crisis. On the other hand, the sons of shopkeepers, kulaks, and petty officials who had been hiding in the factories during the war had had time to find out that the perfect place for them was the Social Revolutionary Party. In September, however, even they were afraid to call themselves social revolutionaries any longer, at least in Petrograd. The workers, the soldiers, and in some provinces, already even the peasants, had abandoned that party. There remained in it only the conservative, bureaucratic, and Philistine strata. All right. Okay. Duke Crystal says, explaining the cultural revolution he mentioned before, that the revolution and class struggle continues under the .p to prevent the party and state from ossifying and falling into revisionism or counter-revolution in the long run. .p, that and class struggles continues under the .p. What the hell is the .p? I'm stupid, everybody. I'm really fucking stupid. I'm sorry. The .p, What the hell is the dot P? I don't know. Anyway, when the masses, awakened by the revolution, gave their confidence to the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks. When the masses, awakened by the revolution, gave their confidence to the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, both these parties were tireless in praising the lofty intelligence of the people. When those same masses, having passed through the schools of events, began to turn sharply toward the Bolsheviks, the compromisers laid the blame for their own collapse upon the ignorance of the people. But the masses would not agree that they had become more ignorant. On the contrary, it seemed to them that they now understood what they had not understood before. So, Duke Crystal says that the revolution and class struggle continues under the dictatorship of the proletariat to prevent the party and state from ossifying and falling into revisionism and counter-revolution in the long run. Okay, now it makes sense. So what he's referencing right here, I think, and I'm not trying to, judge you, because there's no problem with it, but I think you're drawing from Maoism. Mao wanted to have the Cultural Revolution because he thought that the Communist Party was ossifying. It was not as dynamic and as radical as it needed to be. So he basically riled up all the young Chinese people to basically, revive the revolution, continue the revolution, even though the communists had come into power in China. So I somewhat agree with that. I don't believe that a revolution can ever come like top down and we call it proletarian. The class struggle, yes, has to continue organically. So if you are mentioning that this revolution and class struggle continues organically, even in a socialist state, for example, in China, the class struggle still continues because workers have no right to unionize independently. They have no rights to go on strike. You get what I'm saying? In China, also, you don't have basic social safety nets like free healthcare, or it's not like fully, totally free like it would be in a ideal socialist state. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, there's the class struggle will continue organically. Yes, I agree with that. But if you're talking about like a top-down cultural revolution, I would like for you to explain that if that's what you mean. An organic cultural revolution or continued class struggle definitely needs to be allowed. And I believe a socialist state can allow that to still happen because struggle is continuous. We don't believe that, there is an end to struggle in history. I don't believe that. There will always be struggle, right? But I think a socialist state should allow the struggle to continue by allowing workers to continue to organize independently. You get what I'm saying? This is the thing. Some people say that communists don't want democracy. Yes, multi-party liberal democracy. No, we don't need just multiple parties. What we need are multiple independent workers' unions. We need independent organized political organizations that are not bourgeoisie in ideology and character, but independent, so that the people can dictate what their society is like. We want to give all power to the people, not to bourgeois capital interest. You get what I'm saying? But I digress. Let's continue here. The Social Revolutionary Party, as it withered and weakened, also began to split along a social seam, in this process throwing its members over into hostile camps. In the fields and villages there remained those social revolutionaries, who side by side with the Bolsheviks and usually under their leadership had defended themselves against the blows dealt out by social revolutionaries in the government. The sharpening struggle between the two wings brought to life an intermediate group under the leadership of Chernov. This group tried to preserve a unity between the persecutors and the persecuted, became tangled up, arrived in hopeless and often ludicrous contradictions, and still further compromised the party. In order to make it possible for them to appear at mass meetings, the social revolutionary orators were compelled insistently to recommend themselves as lefts, as internationalists, having nothing in common with the clique of March social revolutionaries. After the July days, the left social revolutionaries came out in open opposition, still not breaking formally with the party, but belatedly catching up with arguments and slogans of the Bolsheviks. On the 21st of September, Trotsky, not without a hidden pedagogical intention, declared at a session of the Petrograd Soviet that it was becoming easier and easier for the Bolsheviks to come to an understanding with the left social revolutionaries. In the end, these people split off in the form of an independent party to inscribe in the Book of Revolution one of its most fantastic pages. This was the last flare-up of self-sufficient intellectual radicalism, and a few months after October, there remained nothing of it but a small heap of ashes. There was a deep differentiation also among the Mensheviks. Their Petrograd organization came into sharp conflict with their central committee, their central nucleus, led by Tsereteli, having no peasant reserve, such as the social revolutionaries possessed, melted even more rapidly than they did. Intermediate social democratic groups who adhered to neither of the two principal camps were still trying to unite the Bolsheviks with the Mensheviks. They were still nourishing the illusions of March, when even Stalin had thought desirable a union with Tsereteli and had believed that we will live down petty disagreements within the party. In the latter part of August, there occurred a fusion of the Mensheviks with these advocates of union. At their joint session, the right wing had decided preponderance, and the resolution of Tsereteli favoring war and a coalition with the bourgeoisie got 117 votes out of 79. Tsereteli's victory in the party hastened the defeat of the party in the working class. The Petrograd organization of worker Mensheviks, extremely few in number, followed Martov, pushing him along, irritated by his indecisiveness and getting ready to go over to the Bolsheviks. In the middle of September, the organization of the Vasily Island district joined the Bolshevik party almost as a unit. That hastened the agitation in other districts and in the provinces. The leaders of the different trends of Menshevism furiously accused each other in joint sessions of destroying the party. Gorky's paper, belonging to the left flank of the Mensheviks, stated at the end of September that the Petrograd organization of the party, which had a little while ago numbered about 10,000 members, had practically ceased to exist. The last all-city conference was unable to meet for lack of a quorum. Plekhanov was attacking the Mensheviks from the right. Tsereteli and his friends, he said, without themselves knowing or desiring it, have been preparing the road for Lenin. The political condition of Tsereteli himself in the days of the September tide is clearly depicted in the memoirs of the Kadets Nabokov. The most characteristic quality of his mood at that time was fright at the rising tide of Bolshevism. I remember how he spoke to me in a heart-to-heart conversation about the possibility of a seizure of power by the Bolsheviks. Of course, he said, they will not hold out more than 2 or 3 weeks, but only think what destruction that will mean. This we must avoid at any cost. In his voice was a note of genuine, panic-stricken alarm. Tsereteli was experiencing before October those same moods which had been familiar to Nabokov in the February days. The Soviets were the arena in which the Bolsheviks functioned side by side with the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, although in continual conflict with them. The change in the relative power of the Soviet parties did not, to be sure, immediately, but only with unavoidable laggings and artificial postponements, find its expression in the makeup of the Soviets and their social functioning. Many of the provincial Soviets had already, before the July days, become organs of power. It was so in Ivanovo-Vostonesensk, Lugansk, Setsarin, Kherson, Tomsk, Vladivostok, if not formally, at least in fact, and if not continually, at least sporadically. The Krasnoyarsk Soviet, quite independently, introduced a system of cards for the purchase of objects of personal consumption. The compromisist Soviet in Saratov was compelled to interfere in economic conflicts, to arrest manufacturers, confiscate the tramway belonging to Belgians, introduce workers' control, and organize production in the abandoned factories. In the Urals, where ever since 1905 the Bolsheviks had enjoyed a predominant political influence, the Soviets frequently instituted courts of justice for the trial of citizens, created their own militia in several factories, paying for its equipment out of the factory cash box, organized a workers' inspection which assembled raw materials and fuel for the factories, superintended the sale of manufactured goods, and established a wage scale. In certain districts of the Urals, the Soviets took the land from the landlords and put it under social cultivation. At the Simsk metalworks, the Soviets organized a regional factory administration which took charge of the whole administration, the cash box, the bookkeeping, and the sales department. By this act, the nationalization of the Simsk metal district was roughly accomplished. As early as July, writes V. Elstein, from whom we borrow these data. Not only was everything in the Ural factories in the hands of the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks were already giving object lessons in the solutions of political, economic, and agrarian problems. These lessons were primitive. They were not reduced to a system, not illumined by a theory, but in many respects they anticipated the future roads to be traveled. So Trotsky is just talking about something that I was speaking about earlier, creating a parallel state and demonstrating to the people our praxis, our theory in action. And also that communists are good at business. I mean, think about it. Who better to make money in a capitalist system than somebody who has a strong critique of capitalism? You get what I'm saying? So yeah, what happened here, as Trotsky is laying out, the Soviets took control of the area in the Urals. They, seized the land from the landlords, put it under communal ownership, start raising the wages of the workers, dictating better working conditions and hours, and people like it, and business is doing well. And so, yeah, we have to show people that we have a different view and that communists love making money too. We just like making money for everybody and not allowing a small clique of people to extract wealth from the workers. Continuing here. The July days hit the Soviets far harder than the party or the trade unions, for the struggle then was primarily for the life and death of the Soviets. The party and the trade unions would retain their significance both in a peaceful period and during the difficult times of reaction. Their tasks and methods would change, but not their basic functions. The Soviets, however, could survive only on the basis of a revolutionary situation and would disappear along with it. Uniting the majority of the working class, they brought it face to face with a problem which rises above the needs of all private persons, groups and guilds, above the wage problem, the problem of reforms and improvements in general, the problem, that is, of a conquest of power. But the slogan, all power to the Soviets, seemed shattered along with the July demonstration of the workers and soldiers. That defeat, which weakened the Bolsheviks and the Soviets, weakened the Soviets and the state incomparably more. The government of salvation meant the resurrection of an independent bureaucracy. The renunciation of power by the Soviets meant their humiliation before the commissars, their enfeeblement, their fading away. The decline in the significance of the executive committee found a vivid external expression. The government suggested to the compromisers they evacuate the Tsarwai Palace on the ground that it required repairs in preparation for the Constituent Assembly. During the first half of July, the building of Smolny, where formerly the daughters of the nobility had been educated, was set apart for the Soviets. The bourgeois press now wrote about the giving over to the Soviets of the House of the White Doves in the same tone in which they had formerly talked of the seizure of the Palace of Kishenskaya by the Bolsheviks. Various revolutionary organizations, among them the trade unions which were occupying requisitioned buildings, were subjected to attacks at the same time on the ground of the housing problem. It was no other but a question of crowding the workers' revolution out of the too extensive quarters seized by it within bourgeois society. The cadet press knew no limit to its indignation, somewhat belated to be sure, over the vandalism of the people, their trampling upon the rights of private and state property. But toward the end of July, an unexpected fact was laid bare through the medium of the typographical workers. The parties grouped around the notorious Committee of the State Duma had long ago, it appeared, appropriated to their needs the opulent state printing plant, its dispatching facilities, and its franking privileges. The agitational brochures of the Cadet Party were not only being printed free, but freely distributed by the ton, and moreover with preferential rights throughout the whole country. The executive committee, placed under the necessity of examining this charge, was obliged to confirm it. The Cadet Party, to be sure, only found a new theme for indignation. Could you, indeed, for a moment, place in the same category the seizure of government buildings for destructive purposes, and the use of the properties of the state for the defense of its greatest treasures? In a word, if we, gentlemen, have somewhat light-fingeredly robbed the state, it is only in its own interest. But this argument did not seem convincing to at all. Did not seem convincing to all. The building trades stubbornly believed that they had more rights to a building for their union than the cadets had to the government printing office. The disagreement was not accidental. It was leading straight to the second revolution. The cadets were compelled, in any case, to bite their tongues a little. One of the instructors sent out during the second half of August by the Executive Committee, having made the rounds of the Soviets in the south of Russia, where the Bolsheviks were considerably weaker than in the north, made this report of his disturbing observations. The political moods are noticeably changing. In the upper circles of the masses, a revolutionary mood is growing. As a result of the shift in the policy of the provisional government, in the masses, a wariness and indifference to the revolution is to be felt. There is a noticeable coolness toward the Soviets. The functions of the Soviets are decreasing little by little. That the masses were getting tired of the vacillations of their democratic intermediaries is beyond a doubt, but it was not to the revolution, but to the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks that they were growing cold. This situation was especially unbearable in those localities where the power was, in spite of all programs, actually concentrated in the hands of the compromised Soviets. Utterly entangled in the capitulation of the Executive Committee before the bureaucracy, the leaders no longer dared make any use of their power, and merely compromised the Soviets in the eyes of the masses. A considerable part of the ordinary everyday work, moreover, had passed over from the Soviets to the democratic municipalities, a still greater part to the trade unions and factory and shop committees. Less and less clear became the answer to the questions. Will the Soviets survive? And what will their future be? During the first months of their existence, the Soviets, far outstripping all other organizations, had taken upon themselves the task of creating trade unions, factory committees, clubs, and played a leading part in their work. But once they got on their feet, these workers' organizations came more and more under the leadership of the Bolsheviks. The factory and shop committees, wrote Trotsky in August, are not created out of temporary meetings. The masses elect to these committees those who, at home in the everyday life of the factory, have demonstrated their firmness, their business-like character, and their devotion to the interest of the workers. And these same factory committees, in their overwhelming majority, consist of Bolsheviks. There could no longer be any talk of a guardianship over the factory committees and trade unions exercised by the compromised Soviets. On the contrary, there was a bitter struggle between them. In those problems which touched the masses to the quick, the Soviets were proving less and less capable of standing up against the trade union and factory committees. Thus, for instance, the Moscow unions carried out a general strike in opposition to the decision of the Soviets. In a less clear form, similar conflicts were taking place everywhere, and it was not the Soviets which usually came off victorious. Driven up a blind alley by their own policy, the compromisers found themselves obliged to think up incidental occupations for the Soviets, to switch them over into the cultural field, in the essence of the matter, to entertain them. In vain, the Soviets were created to conduct a struggle for power. For other tasks, other more appropriate organizations existed. The entire work of our Soviet, running in the Menshevik and social revolutionary channel, writes Saratov, Bolshevik, Antonov, lost all meaning. At a meeting of the Executive Committee, we would yawn from boredom till it became indecent. The social revolutionary Menshevik talking mill was empty and trivial. The sickly Soviets were becoming less and less able to serve as a support to their Petrograd center. The correspondence between Smolny and the localities was going into decline. There was nothing to write about, nothing to propose, no prospects remained, and no tasks. This isolation from the masses took the very palpable form of a financial crisis. The compromised Soviets in the provinces were themselves without means, and therefore could not offer support to their staff in Smolny, and the left Soviets demonstratively refused financial support to an executive committee, which had dishonored itself by participating in the work of the counter-revolution. So very interesting what Trotsky is laying out here. Once again, the Bolsheviks were not, masterminds of the Russian Revolution. They were not these geniuses who were just able to convince people to go along with their crazy communist ideas. The workers were the ones who had a relationship off and on, as Trotsky is putting it, with the Bolsheviks. The workers were insisting for a better society. The workers were insisting for a more equitable and fair world. This process of fading out of the Soviets was crossed, however, by processes of another and partly opposite character. Far off from frontiers, backward counties, and inaccessible corners were waking up and creating their own Soviets, and these would manifest a revolutionary freshness until they fell under the demoralizing influence of the center or under the repressions of the government. The total number of Soviets was growing rapidly. At the end of August, the Secretariat of the Executive Committee counted as many as 600 Soviets, behind which stood 23 million electors. The official Soviet system had been raised up over a human ocean, which was billowing powerfully and driving its waves leftward. The political revival of the Soviets, which coincided with their Bolshevization, began from the bottom. In Petrograd, the first voice to be lifted was that of the district locals. On July 21st, a delegation from an inter-district conference of the Soviets presented to the Executive Committee a list of demands: dissolve the State Duma, confirm the inviolability of the army organizations by a decree of the government, restore the left press, stop the disarming of workers, put an end to mass arrest, bridle the right press, bring to an end the disbandment of regiments and the death penalty at the front. A lowering of the political demands here, in comparison with the July demonstration, is quite obvious. But this was only a first step toward convalescence. In cutting down the slogans, the districts were trying to broaden their base. The leaders of the Executive Committee diplomatically welcomed the sensitiveness of the district Soviets, but confined their response to the assertion that all misfortunes had resulted from the July insurrection. The two sides parted politely, but coolly. So this is something that speaks to us, especially on the left, as we live in liberal bourgeois dictatorships, where constantly we are seeing progression from the right wing and regression for even just the basic crumbs of a social safety net. Here, Trotsky is saying that the Soviets are demanding, basic things. Stop disarming the workers, stop taking away our guns, stop, mass arresting people, stop the war in general, right? And this was, a compromise for many of the things, because before they were saying all power to the Soviets, down with the Duma, we want the Soviet Union. That's what Trotsky was saying the workers were demanding before. But they made an appeal to the masses by toning down the rhetoric. And this is something that we go back and forth with amongst the left. It's a question I have for the audience. What do you think? How far should we tone down our rhetoric, or even tone down our actual demands to broaden our appeal to people? It's a profound question that goes on and on and on forever, endlessly. I will continue here. Upon this program of the district Soviets, a significant campaign was opened. Izvestia printed from day to day resolutions of Soviets, trade unions, factories, battleships, army units, demanding the dissolution of the State Duma, an end of repressions against the Bolsheviks, and indulgences to the counter-revolution. Upon this general background, certain more radical voices were heard. On the 22nd of July, the Soviet of Moscow province, considerably in advance of the Soviet of Moscow itself, passed a resolution in favor of the transfer of power to the Soviets. On July 26th, the Ivano-Vosnesensk Soviet branded with contempt the method of struggle employed against the party of the Bolsheviks and sent a greeting to Lenin, the glorious leader of the revolutionary proletariat. Elections held at the end of July and during the first half of August at many points in the country brought about, as a general rule, a strengthening of the Bolshevik factions in the Soviets. In Kronstadt, raided and made notorious throughout Russia, the new Soviet contained 100 Bolsheviks, 75 left social revolutionaries, 12 Menshevik internationalists, 7 anarchists, and over 90 non-party men, of whom not one dared openly acknowledge his sympathy for the compromisers. At a regional congress of the Soviets of the Urals, opening on August 18th, there were 86 Bolsheviks, 40 social revolutionaries, 23 Mensheviks, Zatsarine became an object of special hatred to the bourgeois press. For here, not only had the Soviet become Bolshevik, but the leader of the local Bolsheviks, Lenin, was elected burgomaster. Kerensky sent a punitive expedition against Zatsarine, a city which was a red rag to the Don Cossack ataman Kaledin, without any serious pretext and with the sole aim of destroying a revolutionary nest. In Petrograd, Moscow, and all the industrial districts, more and more hands were being raised every day for the Bolshevik proposals. The events at the end of August subjected the Soviets to a test. Under the shadow of danger, an inner regrouping took place very swiftly. It took place everywhere, and with comparatively little debate. In the provinces, as in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks, stepchildren of the official Soviet system, were advanced to the front rank, but also in the staff of the Compromise Party. The March Socialists, the politicians of ministerial and official waiting rooms, were temporarily crowded back by more militant elements tempered in the underground movement. For this new grouping of forces, a new organizational form was needed. The leadership of the revolutionary defense was nowhere concentrated in the hands of the executive committees. They were a little use in the form in which Kornilov's insurrection found them for fighting action. Everywhere there were formed special committees of defense, revolutionary committees, staffs. They relied upon the Soviets, made reports to them, but represented a new selection of elements, a new method of action corresponding to the revolutionary nature of the task. The Moscow Soviet created, as in the days of the State Conference, a fighting group of 6, which alone should have the right to deploy armed forces and make arrests. The Regional Congress of Kiev, which met at the end of August, advised its local Soviets not to hesitate to replace unreliable representatives of the power, both military and civil, and take measures for the immediate arrest of counter-revolutionists and the arming of the workers. In Vyatka, the Soviet Committee assumed extraordinary rights, including the disposition of the armed forces. In Zatsarine, the whole power went over to the Soviet staff. In Nizhny Novgorod, the Revolutionary Committee established its sentries at the post and telegraph offices. The Krasnoyarsk Soviet concentrated both the civil and military power in its hands. Very, very important for us to take into consideration what Trotsky is saying here. As Marx told us and as Lenin told us, the armed worker will be the defense of the revolution. And how did the Soviets end up with armed workers? How did they end up with a force that was willing to lay their lives down for the protection of these worker councils? It was through the consistent propaganda and agitation of the soldier, and allowing the soldiers, who most likely could have been very right-wing or more prone to right-wing tendencies, to come into the fold, surrender their weapons, and allow themselves to also be a part of the new Soviet system. Something that we should take into account. Okay? So, let's continue here. We have a few people in the comment section. Okay, somebody says Sean Capri, shirt for July 4th. Yeah, I did kind of wanted to bring out the red, white, and blue colors. You know what I'm saying? I did want to bring it out. But you know how it is. It's fuck America, man. It's fuck America. We trying to bring that bitch down. We trying to bring down the evil empire on this side. But you know what America hates most. You know what America hates most. They hate this. They hate this. They hate this. So I love to mix. My favorite thing is to mix the things that contrast in this white supremacist, capitalistic, decadent world that we live in. I like to mix my black skin, my beautiful melanin, with the symbols of empire as a big fuck you. As a big fuck you. I have no problem wearing American flag colors or emblems because, number one, that's my country that my ancestors fought and died for. Literally, my great-grandfather went to go fight in World War I, and I come from a line of veterans. But yeah, I like to mix the things that are hated in this world with the things that are treasured to show that none of this means anything. Once again, that's why you see me online sometimes coming on wearing suits, because of the color of my skin and where I come from and how I am racialized. People should expect, or people racialize me or stereotype me as being non-intelligent, non-critical, non-analytical in my thinking. So I like to just present myself as somebody who they don't match those two things together. Everything I do in my life, because everything is political, is meant to be a big fuck you to the white supremacists. Everything I do in my life is supposed to be a big fuck you to the capitalists, to the racists, to the supporters of empire. My whole life is about saying fuck you to the descendants of the people that put mine on auction blocks. You get what I'm saying? That's what my whole life is about. You feel me? Anyway, who else is up in here? Okay. All right. Anyway, we have a very interesting comment here. Impossible Bling says the Russians had an actual reason to revolt. Hence, the Bolshevik communist is the opposite of absolutism by the Tsar, and the country was starving, and a democracy that wasn't managed right. Generally, I agree. We've been reading Trotsky's history for much longer, so I have a much more nuanced answer than that. But that's generally right. Generally right. We have to let that slide, okay? But anyway, I will continue here. All right. The Moscow Soviets created, as in the days of the State Conference, a fighting group of 6 which alone should have the right to deploy armed forces and make arrests. The Regional Congress of Kiev, which met at the end of August, advised its local Soviets not to hesitate to replace unreliable representatives of the power, both military and civil, and take measures for the immediate arrest of counter-revolutionists and the arming of workers. In Vyatka, the Soviet Committee assumed extraordinary rights, including the disposition of the armed forces. In Satsarin, the whole power went over to the Soviet staff. In Nizhny Novgorod, the Revolutionary Committee established its sentries at the post and telegraph offices. The Krasnoyarsk Soviet concentrated both the civil and military power in its hands. Okay? I know I read that paragraph before, but I'm just running through it again. With various qualifications, at times substantial, the same picture was reproduced almost everywhere, and it was by no means a mere imitation of Petrograd. The mass constitution of the Soviets gave the character of a general law to their inner evolution, making them all react in like manner to any great event. While the two parts of the coalition were divided by a civil war front, the Soviets had actually gathered around themselves all the living forces of the nation. Running into this wall, the offensive of the generals had crumbled into dust. A more instructive lesson could not possibly be demanded. In spite of all efforts of the authorities, in spite of all efforts of the authorities to crowd out the Soviets and deprive them of power, says the declaration of the Bolsheviks on this theme, the Soviets manifested during the putting down of the Kornilov revolt the irrepressible might and initiative of the popular mass. After this new experience, which nothing will ever drive out of the consciousness of the workers, soldiers, and peasants, the cry raised at the very beginning of the revolution by our party, all power to the Soviets, has become the voice of the whole revolutionary country. All right. The city Dumas, which had made an effort to compete with the Soviets, died down in the days of danger and vanished. The Petrograd Duma humbly sent its delegation to the Soviet for an explanation of the general situation and the establishment of contact. It would seem as though the Soviets, elected by a part of the city's population, should have had less power and influence than the Dumas, elected by the whole population. But the dialectic of the revolutionary process has demonstrated that in certain historic conditions, the part is incomparably greater than the whole. As in the government, so in the Duma, the compromisers. Sorry, I need to take a water break. Oh, I need some water real quick. Sorry. All right. All right. Sorry. All right. As in the government, so in the Duma, the compromisers formed a bloc with the Kadets against the Bolsheviks. And that bloc paralyzed the Duma as it had the government. The Soviet, on the other hand, proved the natural form of defensive cooperation between the compromisers and the Bolsheviks against the attack of the bourgeoisie. All right. Shout out to Bakalu Baka up in the live stream. He says, Simon says Tariq Nasheed and FBA are a hate group. Generally, yes. And if you don't know, I am a member of the CPUSA. And last night, I was in a meeting with my CPUSA members, who, and also in attendance, is the leader of the CPUSA, who is a black man, a foundational black American, whose name is Joe Sims. So if you don't know, the leader of the Communist Party of the United States, there are many leaders, but the figurehead and one of the most prominent members is a man named Joe Sims. And I brought to Joe Sims' attention the FBA movement and the ADOS movement. If you go to the Instagram page of the Communist Party of the United States, my video on Juneteenth is on the front page, and I hope to do more work with the CPUSA. So I told Joe Sims and all the other CPUSA members last night that one of the growing online movements directed towards black people, particularly black men, young black men of my generation and younger, is the FBA movement and ADOS movement. And I let them know that we need to have some counter propaganda for the FBA and ADOS thing. So coming out very soon will be a video from the CPUSA addressing FBA and ADOS. And primarily what I want everybody to know, is that the Communist Party of the United States, stands for and advocates for, unequivocally, indubitably, in the words of Trotsky, reparations for black Americans, foundational black Americans. Okay? I want everybody to know this. And for anybody pointing out I misspelled Vietnam, I was typing it while I was in class. So pardon that. If Vietnam is actually misspelled, I don't know, and I'm not checking, and it doesn't matter. But I want everybody to know the CPUSA absolutely stands for and advocates for reparations for black Americans. And that's not me. That's coming from the top guy, Joe Sims, the black man who is the, leader of the CPUSA right now. Okay? He told me out of his own mouth, we want 40 acres and a mule plus some in capital. You get what I'm saying? But the FBA and ADOS people have no critique of capitalism. They have no critique of our fascist, decadent, white supremacist society. They have no critique of how our sexist society continues to let women die every single year and wants no freedom for us as a people. So I want everybody to know that, because that's something I'm extremely passionate about. Fighting against fascism is not only fighting against crazy rednecks and white people with SS tattoos. It also comes from within the house. Okay? So yes, I want everybody to know that. The Communist Party of the United States of America advocates for reparations for black Americans. Okay? And we will fight to the end against all forms of fascism, including the FBA movement. Okay? Okay? And no, that does not mean that we are against foundational black Americans or people whose descendants go back to chattel slavery in these United States. That does not mean that we stand against those people, because I'm one of those people. Joe Sims is one of those people. Many of the other members of the CPUSA are foundational black Americans. It's just that we don't have hate for Africans and Caribbeans and other people from the global south who are immigrating to the United States. Yes, there is anti-blackness in groups of non-white people, especially in some immigrant groups. We understand that. But that does not mean at all that somehow us bashing on Latinos, Africans, Caribbeans is somehow going to get us closer to reparations. Okay? And being politically non-active is going to get us anywhere closer to that. Okay? BDP says, Reparations from who and to whom? I want everybody to pay attention. Don't listen to anybody who says to who rather than to whom. Because anybody with intelligence would know that we write to whom. Whom is written after prepositions, good sir. But then again, don't listen to me because I misspelled Vietnam. Yeah, so let's go here. Let's continue here. All right. Swarvy Weinstein says, what is fighting to the end? Hopefully you don't mean violence. I absolutely mean violence. I absolutely mean violence, as we have read in Lenin's The State and Revolution, as we have continued to read in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. There is nothing more violent than a revolution, and that is what it will take to overthrow capitalism and white supremacy. We beg for that day that we will violently overthrow this system of oppression that keeps all of us in bondage. Yes, we are talking about violence. There is no such thing as a non-violent revolution. Okay? Make it make sense. Make it make sense. We absolutely love that. We want that. We wish for that. The state only exists for the oppression of one class for another, and I am sick of being oppressed by the bourgeoisie. Okay? So yes, we want the violent overthrow of capitalism. All right? But I digress. All right. So, after the Kornilov days, a new chapter opened for the Soviets. Although the compromisers still retained a considerable number of bad spots, especially in the garrison, the Petrograd Soviet showed such a sharp careen in the direction of the Bolsheviks as to astonish both camps. Let's repeat that again. After the Kornilov days, a new chapter opened for the Soviets. Although the compromisers still retained a considerable number of bad spots, especially in the garrison, the Petrograd Soviet showed such a sharp careen in the direction of the Bolsheviks as to astonish both camps, both right and left. On the night of September 1st, while still under the presidency of Trotsky, the Soviet voted for a government of workers and peasants. The rank-and-file members of the compromisers' factions almost solidly supported the resolution of the Bolsheviks. The rival proposal of Tsatsarelli got only about 15 votes. The compromisers' presidium could not believe their eyes. The right demanded a roll call, and this dragged on until 3 o'clock in the morning. To avoid openly voting against their parties, many of the delegates went home. But even so, and in spite of all methods of pressure, the resolution of the Bolsheviks received in the final vote 279 votes against 115. That was a big fact. That was the beginning of the end. The Presidium, stunned, announced that they would resign. On September 2nd, at a joint session of the Russian-Soviet institutions of Finland, a resolution was adopted by 700 votes against 13, with 36 abstaining, favoring a government of Soviets. On the 5th, the Moscow Soviet followed in the steps of the Petrograd by 355 votes against 254. It not only expressed its want of the confidence of the provisional government, declaring it a weapon of counter-revolution, but also condemned the coalition policy of the executive committee. The Presidium, headed by Kinchuk, announced they would resign. A Congress of the Soviets of Central Siberia, meeting at Krasnoyarsk on September 5th, followed the Bolshevik leadership throughout. On the 8th, the Bolshevik resolution was adopted in the Kiev Soviet of Workers' Deputies by a majority of 130 against 66, although there were only 95 deputies in the official Bolshevik faction. At the Finland Congress of the Soviets, which met on the 10th, 155,000 sailors, soldiers, and Russian workers were represented by 69 Bolsheviks, 48 left social revolutionaries, and a few non-party men. The Soviet of Peasants, deputies of Petrograd province, elected the Bolshevik Sergeyev as a delegate to the conference. Here again, it was revealed that in those cases where the party is able, through the mediation of workers or soldiers, to get into immediate contact with the villages, the peasantry eagerly flock to its banner. The dominance of the Bolshevik Party. The dominance of the Bolshevik Party. Okay, hold on. Before I jump into that, Bakalu Baka is up in here. Simon, is Russia a communist country under Vladimir Putin? Okay, Bakalu Baka is really dumb. Bakalu Baka, this is something you should Google. No. There is no such thing as a communist country. There are countries that are building socialism. There's no such thing as a communist country. But even then, Putin is not a communist. Though the Communist Party of Russia does actually come in second place in all of their presidential elections. So there is a strong desire for the communists to come back into power. Okay? So, let's continue here. By the way, shout out to Du Crystal Lafumi. He is up in the chat doing a wonderful job. Everybody salute our top commissar who is making sure the chat remains clean. I am responding to comments. I am reading a book right now. If you are not interested in engaging in the book club or engaging in Trotsky's work, The History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, Chapter 34, The Masses, if you are not interested in that, please see yourself out. If you want to be forcefully removed, we can do that too. We can forcefully remove you as well. So, I just want everybody to know that. If you are here to engage in the text, to actually learn, you can actually stay. If you don't, we can easily send you back to that shitty, hellhole, dirty, disgusting country called India that you come from. Sit your ass down back in a pool full of shit, you untouchable bitch. Don't come around here no more. We are here to read and learn, not to bring dirty, disgusting, curry-tipped fingers up in this bitch talking about all types of nasty shit as you type on a Nokia, pressing double on the 2 to try to get to letter B. Get the fuck out of here, bitch. All right? Continuing here. The dominance of the Bolshevik Party in the Petrograd Soviet was dramatically certified at the historic session of September 9th. All the factions had diligently rounded up their members. It is a question of the fate of the Soviets. About 1,000 workers and soldiers, deputies assembled. Had the vote of September 1st been a mere episode caused by the accidental constitution of the session, or did it mean a complete change in the policy of the Soviet? Thus the question was posed, fearing lest they could not assemble a majority against the Presidium, of which all the compromised leaders were members. Trotsky, Tsatsarelli, Chernov, Gotz, Dam, Skobelev. The Bolshevik faction made a motion that the Presidium be elected on a proportional basis. This proposal, which would obscure to a certain degree the sharpness of the conflict about principles, and was on this account roundly condemned by Lenin, had this tactical advantage, that it made sure of the support of the wavering elements. But Tsatsarelli rejected the compromise. The Presidium wants to know, he said, whether the Soviet has actually changed its direction. We cannot carry out the tactics of the Bolsheviks. The resolution introduced by the right declared that the vote of September 1st did not correspond to the political line of the Soviet, and that the Soviet had confidence as before in its Presidium. There was nothing left for the Bolsheviks to do but accept the challenge, and they did with great willingness. Trotsky appearing for the first time after his liberation from prison and warmly welcomed by a considerable part of the assembly. Both sides were inwardly measuring the applause. Is it a majority or not? Demanded an explanation before the vote. Is Kerensky, as before, a member of the Presidium? The Presidium, after hesitating a moment, answered in the affirmative. Thus, although already weighed down with sins, tying another millstone around its neck, we had firmly believed, said Trotsky, that Kerensky would not be allowed to sit in the Presidium. We were mistaken. The ghost of Kerensky now sits between Dan and Trotsky. When they propose to you to sanction the political line of the Presidium, do not forget that you will be sanctioning the policies of Kerensky. The meeting proceeded in the utmost imaginable tension. Order was preserved by the desire of each and every person there to permit an explosion. They all wanted to count as soon as possible the numbers of their friends and enemies. All understood that they were deciding the question of power, of the war, of the fate of the revolution. It was decided to vote by the method of withdrawing from the room. Those should go out who accepted the resignation of the Presidium. It is easier for a minority to go out than a majority. In every corner of the hall, an impassioned, although whispered agitation now began. The old Presidium or the new, the coalition or the Soviet power. A large crowd of people seemed to be drifting toward the door, too large in the opinion of the Presidium. The Bolshevik leaders, on their part, estimated they would lack about 100 votes of the majority, and that will be doing excellently well. They comforted themselves in advance, but the workers and soldiers kept on drifting and drifting toward the door. There was a hushed rumble of voices, brief explosions of loud argument. From one side, a voice shouted out, "Kornilovist," from the other, "July heroes." The procedure lasted about an hour. The arms of an unseen scale were oscillating. The presidium, hardly able to contain its excitement, remained throughout the whole hour upon the platform. At last, the result was counted and weighed. For the presidium and the coalition, 414 votes against 515, abstaining 67. The new majority applauded like a storm, ecstatically, furiously. It had a right to. The victory had been well paid for. A good party of the road lay ahead. A good part of the road lay behind. Still bewildered by the blow, with long faces, the overthrown leaders withdraw from the platform. Cesarilli cannot refrain from one last dreadful prophecy. "We withdraw from this tribune," he cries, turning halfway around as he moves, in the consciousness that for half a year we have held worthily and held high the banner of the revolution. This banner has now passed into your hands. We can only express the wish that you may be to hold it in the same way for half as long. Cesarilli was cruelly mistaken about his dates as about everything. So this is a very, heroic thing. Like, if this were a Hollywood movie, this would be like where, all the guys throw their hands in the air, everybody's celebrating. Trotsky takes the girl and dips her, then kisses her deeply, and everybody's just celebrating. Because essentially what they did was they beat the liberals at their own game. They showed that all that repression that they put on them only made the Bolsheviks even stronger. And electorally, they showed up and were able to outflank the liberals and the bourgeoisie and the reformists and the compromisers, all by standing their ground. It's a very, very powerful scene and something we should all take into account as well. Okay? Bakalubaka says, "Simon, what role does the powerful shadow government oligarchs play in socialism?" I would like to inverse that for you, Bakalubaka. There is no shadow government. The rich oligarchs play in our fucking faces. A lot of people agree that the world is run by rich people who have insane amounts of power. They're able to buy our politicians, get their laws passed. They're able to essentially have their way in more ways than one, like on Epstein Island. But they don't have to do it in private. They do it out in public. What socialists believe is that essentially there is a rich class of people. There's a class of people who own the means of production, how we do our jobs, and the resources under our feet, who have the ability to influence and have outsized influence in our society. And what we want to do is inverse that to make the people that create the wealth of an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos actually have the power in a society, rather than us being at their whims. So, is there a shadow government? There is no shadow government right now. And in a socialist society, or a society that is trying to build socialism, the government is for the people, thus not being in the shadows. But if you still believe that a secret, rich, Illuminati, Masonic, Rock Nation, Jay-Z, Illuminati thing exists, that's in your own head. But what we actually see in real life is shit like, motherfuckers like Peter Thiel doing private dinners with his all rich buddies who are very famous, such as Sam Altman from ChatGPT, talking about the Antichrist, moving to Nazi Argentina, buying up private islands and bunkers, making sure the wages are depressed, etc., etc. All right. Cheesy Ches says, "I blame the Democrats, the DNC, and Joe Biden for giving us Trump." Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. That is a truest. That is one of the realest and trillest statements we've heard today. Anyway, continuing here. We only have a page and a half to go. So any comments or questions put in, I will try to get to them before we wrap it up. Let's go here. The Petrograd Soviet, the parent of all other Soviets, henceforth stood under the leadership of the Bolsheviks, who had been only yesterday an insignificant little bunch of demagogues. Trotsky from the Tribune reminded the Presidium that the charge against the Bolsheviks of being in the service of the German staff had not been withdrawn. Let the Milikovs and Guchkovs tell the story of their lives day by day. They dare not do it. They dare not to do it. But we are ready any day to give an account of our activities. We have nothing to hide from the Russian people. The Petrograd Soviets, in a special resolution, branded with contempt the authors, distributors, and promoters of the slander. The Bolsheviks now entered upon their inheritance. It proved at once colossal and extraordinarily slender. The executive committee had in good season taken away from the Petrograd Soviet the two newspapers established by it, all the administrative offices, all funds, and all technical equipment, including the typewriters and inkwells. The innumerable automobiles which had been at the disposal of the Soviet since the February days had every last one of them been transferred into the keeping of the compromisist Olympus. The new leaders had nothing, no treasury, no newspaper, no secretarial apparatus, no means of locomotion, no pen and no pencil, nothing but the blank walls and the burning confidence of the workers and soldiers. That, however, proved sufficient. After this fundamental break in the policy of the Soviet, the ranks of the compromisers began to melt even more rapidly. On the 11th of September, where Dan defended the coalition before the Petrograd Soviet and Trotsky spoke for a Soviet government, the coalition was ejected by all votes against 10, with 7 abstaining. On the same day, the Moscow Soviet, by a unanimous vote, condemned the repressions against the Bolsheviks. The compromisers soon found themselves pushed away into a narrow sector on the right, such as that which the Bolsheviks had occupied on the left at the beginning of the revolution. But with what a difference. The Bolsheviks had always been stronger among the masses than in the Soviets. The Bolsheviks had always been stronger among the masses than in the Soviets. The compromisers, on the contrary, still had a larger place in the Soviets than among the masses. The Bolsheviks, in their period of weakness, had a future. The compromisers had nothing left but a past, and one of which they had no reason to be proud. So, what Trotsky is saying here is that essentially the Bolsheviks ended up becoming successful despite them essentially being fed to the lions in the Colosseum by the Romans. What happened is that the people eventually trusted them, turned to them, because the Bolsheviks continued to press for the end of the war, for the workers to receive better wages and working conditions, for the women to stop getting disrespected, for the peasants to have the land that they work on be their own and not have to pay tribute to some landlord miles and miles away. The Bolsheviks continued to stand their ground. The people respected them. And even if they didn't understand or agree with everything these crazy communists were saying, they vested their power in them. And the Bolsheviks had to constantly struggle to keep up with the people. The people, the masses, were demanding a leftward turn. And the Bolsheviks finally lived up to their destiny, I would say. You know, it's interesting. Some people say that the working class has a destiny. I think a party has a destiny, and a successful party is one that fulfills its destiny of meeting the needs of the people. But I digress. Bakulu Baka is laughing. Maybe he's laughing at the Epstein Island joke, but I'm telling you, Bakulu Baka, you're probably already a socialist. You're probably already a communist and don't know it. You probably agree with some of my basic premises that we live in a society that's unequal because there are people who are able to extract more wealth than they deserve from the backs of people who work for them or under them, or tendentially contribute to their wealth. I think we could all agree with that. And by extension, we need to just leave some of our regressive thoughts behind and actually gain class consciousness. Okay? So, shout out to all of my commissars up in here. Make sure that we continue to get trolls and white supremacists and fascists out of here. Okay, so, damn, we just double teamed them. Du Cristal a la Fumi. Du Cristal a la Fumi. we just tag teamed that boy. I put my cock in his mouth. You put his cock. You put your cock in his butt, and we just ran through that little bitch, didn't we? We just ran a little train on that little hoe, didn't we? Damn, we both. How you get banned by both? Damn, we just ran a little train. All right. Anyway, shout out to Noodle Knocker up in this thing. wait, you didn't have to ban Noodle Knocker. You didn't have to ban Noodle Knocker. You didn't have to ban Noodle Knocker, man. Anyway, if they compliment the shirt, it's fine. Let's just make some things clear. If they compliment the shirt or the outfit, it's all fine. Anyway, shout out to Max Carlos fan up in here. And Bakalu Baka says, what's your opinion on the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II? Fuck Tsar Nicholas II. He could die. I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck. Listen, man, when you're a black person descended from slavery, I've lost all sense of humanity. If I could see babies die and I laugh. You get what I'm saying? Because the world looks at our pain and thinks nothing of it. So if a baby dies, if a nigga falls from a building, if the whole Middle East could blow up, I don't give a fuck. I'm going to tell the motherfuckers what they tell me. Get over it. Get over it. Get over it. If Tsar Nicholas II got clapped and his whole family got clapped, get over it. I don't care. I don't care. That's my opinion of Tsar. He wasn't assassinated. And by the way, Tsar Nicholas II was directly involved in sending hundreds of thousands of loyal Russian citizens to die on the front lines of a war that he knew they couldn't win. Okay? So that man was a murderer. Okay? I don't care. Clap his whole family up. Clap his descendants up. I don't care. Okay? What do I think about Laos? Laos is cool. I fuck with Laos. I fuck with Laos. I fuck with Laos. I fuck with Vietnam. Fuck with all of them. Anyway. Continuing here. Together with its change, of course, the Petrograd Soviet changed its external aspect. The compromised leaders completely disappeared from the horizon, digging themselves in the executive committee. In the Soviet, they were displaced by stars on the second and third magnitude. With the disappearance of Tsetsereli, Chernov, Avkenstiev, Skobelev, the friends and admirers of these democratic ministers also ceased to appear. The radical-minded officers and ladies, the semi-socialistic writers, the people of culture and celebrity. The Soviet became more homogenous, grayer, darker, more serious. Damn. Okay, Trotsky. Okay. All right, so that's the end of chapter 34. Shout out to everybody who tuned in for episode 35 today in this live stream. And yeah, looking forward to seeing more of you all who have joined this live stream. Shout out to everybody who's joined. And that was a very, very interesting chapter. It's very refreshing to see the Bolsheviks finally bounce back. Okay, let's close up this poll. I hope one day to visit Laos and all of the existing socialist countries, but Laos is definitely on my must-see before I go. Okay? So, as far as the horizontal live stream, best leftist party in the USA right now, unsure, but fuck Trump and MAGA got 100% of the votes. That's good. That's good to hear. And let's go to the vertical live stream right here and see what y'all voted on. Once again. Okay, so yes, I misspelled Vietnam by adding an E at the end, which was an obvious typo. But I digress. People come in here to troll. Anyway, so which existing socialist state would you like to visit? Unsure, but fuck Trump and MAGA, 38% of the votes. Cuba, 28% of the votes. Vietnam, 24% of the votes. And Laos with 10% of the votes, with 29 votes in total. Very cool. Very cool. Cuba got the highest percentage. I did not expect that. And I would definitely like to visit Laos one day, as well as Vietnam and Cuba. And all power to the people. Y'all be easy out there. And peace.